Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Building the Black Educator Pipeline. I am your host, Shayna Terrell, still out here being an educator activist and fighting for freedom and liberation for my people. So I want to give a big shout out to all my co-conspirators watching out there and that come back every week, and a major shout out to any new guests that we have this week. But I really want to thank you guys because over the past couple of weeks, I really understand what it means when people say that they're inspired by people who support them. You guys keep me on my toes. You keep me planning good content, having great guests on, and I appreciate your love and your support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I truly appreciate y'all. And as always, shout out to Citizens Ed and the Center for Black Educator Development for creating this platform where we can talk to real people in the real struggle, doing the real work. Shout out, y'all. Oh, y'all, it is Pride Month. Happy Pride Month, y'all. So thanks for joining us today as we break down barriers and celebrate our LGBTQI plus family. Today we have a treat. We'll be continuing with our theme of inclusivity and building a Black teacher pipeline. But today we'll be discussing how to create a safe and affirming environment for our LGBTQI educators. We are joined today by two school leaders, and they'll share their experiences with us about identifying as members as the LGBTQI family and their experience in the education ecosystem. So let me introduce you guys to our first guest, who is my brother from another mother and father, Mr. Raymond Fields. He served as a founding principal of Mastery Prep Elementary Charter School since 2018. Prior to that, Ray served as the principal of Mastery Charter Simon Gratz Prep Middle beginning in 2013. He was the founding principal, by the way. Under Raymond's leadership, Prep Middle achieved double-digit gains for the past 2 consecutive years on ELA sections of the PSSA. The school also received the Schools to Learn From Award from Teach for America Philadelphia for excellence in culturally relevant pedagogy. Raymond has been an educator since 2005. Prior to becoming a principal, Raymond served as a 3rd grade teacher, assistant principal, and program director for Teach for America. So please welcome Raymond Fields. And our next guest joining us, Chloe Mann, is the assistant principal of STEM instruction at Mastery Prep Elementary. They oversee the math and science curriculum as well as teacher development in these subjects. In their previous role with Teach for America, Chloe worked as manager of teacher leadership and development for high school teachers in the Miami-Dade region. Shout out to Miami. Chloe was responsible for increasing literacy outcomes for students for whom English was a second language. Before joining Teach for America staff, Chloe was a 2015 core member in Philadelphia where they taught algebra and reading interventions to 9th and 11th grade students. Originally from Atlanta, Chloe holds a master's degree in education from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's degree in both English and applied mathematics from Agnes Scott College. When they are not working, they enjoy hiking and traveling with their partner. Shout out to Chloe and Ray. Welcome to the show, y'all. Wait, hold on, Ray. We might have you on mute. There we go. You off mute, boo?
Yep, I believe I am now. Thank you for having us, Shayna. Sister, I love you. Thank you so much for allowing us to speak our truth, to share on this platform, and to hopefully impact so many in terms of just representation. So thank you so much for allowing us to be here today.
Of course. Welcome, y'all. And as always, my co-conspirators watching, please like, share, and comment and engage in today's show. So again, happy Pride Month, and I'm happy to have the two of you on. Representation matters, your voice matters, and your work as just educators matter. So I want to start off with the people hearing from you guys to talk to us about your journey in education. Why did y'all decide to become educators? Ray, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really stems from this understanding that education liberates. It provides opportunities. It provides pathways. And I come from a household where neither of my parents had the opportunity to graduate high school. So being a first high school and college graduate, it allowed me to create a means of advocacy, a pathway for kids that look just like me. So it was really rooted to me in social justice and liberation, and avenues to provide pathways for kids that look just like me, and unapologetically serving Black and brown students. I wouldn't want to do it any other way. It just really stems from that understanding that it really is aligned to my life's purpose.
So, Chloe, can you please share with us your journey? Why did you decide to become an educator?
Growing up in Atlanta public schools, I remember what it was like to have teachers who were mostly white. I remember what it was like to have teachers who were mostly straight, and how isolated that made me feel, and what a profound impact that had on my identity as I grew up. And so graduating from college, when I had the opportunity to apply my skills to make a difference, education just seemed like the natural path, because I wanted students to have mirrors in their classrooms.
Amazing. So both of you felt like a personal dedication to this journey. Absolutely. Which is super important. Now, both of you work out in PA with me, so you know the abysmal numbers of Black educators out here, right? The education landscape in Philadelphia is 90%, 96% white. So the fact that you guys are in education and serving Black children, like, just a major shout out to you. But I would love to hear from you guys. Like, why do you think building the Black educator pipeline is so important? Why do our children need more Black educators?
I think Chloe said it beautifully, and it's the idea and it's the understanding that our kids need mirrors. I know that when I step into spaces with other Black people, there's a kinship, there's an understanding, there's a relationship, there's just a bond that is automatically there. Mm-hmm. And you can't speak my truth if you haven't lived my truth. So oftentimes it's difficult to connect specifically with white colleagues about situations and issues of those in marginalized groups, or those who are treated differently based upon systemic oppression and things of that nature. So what Chloe said earlier resonates with me. Like, mirrors matter, representation matters. Those who shared similar experiences to you, all of these things matter. And also to recognize, I know that you and I had a chance to talk briefly before the podcast began about a previous podcast that you had, that, like, being Black is not one isolated thing, that we are so diverse, so many moving pieces too. So I just wanted to always make sure that I am creating pipelines, creating avenues to build and provide spaces for more Black educators in the spaces that which I lead, and most importantly, providing outlets so our students have mirrors of their experiences, and basically mirrors of the people that they look towards to provide them the highest quality education.
To echo what Ray was saying about, Blackness being like a spectrum as far as identity, I think it's so important for students to know that there are different ways to be Black. You can be Black and queer, you can be Black and straight, you can be Black and from Philly, or Black and from the South. And so I think that the more Black educators we can get in front of students, the more possibilities they see for themselves.
And I like that, how you pointed that out, that there are different ways to be Black. And I think that it's important, and I stated this earlier, that representation matters. The reason why I wanted to do this show and like really lift this up, of course, is Pride Month, right? Shout out. But another reason why is there's like an unspoken association at times with being a part of the LGBTQIA family. Is sometimes people see it as being anti-Black, or like it's not a part of Black culture, where people can't bring their whole selves to a space and just authentically live out loud and be them. And I think that can be problematic. And I think a lot of times in education spaces, we talk a lot about racial identity and racial affirmation. I think education can be an extremely heteronormative space.
Absolutely.
Which can be not only for educators, but also for children, like a really emotionally violent space, right? If I'm seeing all of these heteronormative things that I don't identify with or I don't align with. So I would love to hear from the two of you, like, why is it important for us to really talk about and lift up gender identity in education spaces? Not only for students, but for fellow teachers and educators too.
Yeah, Chloe, would you like to go first?
Yeah, learning is a really, really vulnerable endeavor. And it's difficult for students to embark upon that journey if they feel like they can't show up and they can't be their whole selves. And queerness is a part of the Black experience. And as educators, we have the responsibility of guiding students as they discover who they are. And so if we don't even present that as a possibility, if we don't even show them that this is a valid way of being, then it's difficult for them to commit themselves to learning.
So, Chloe, I want to harp on two things you said. Like you said, education is like or learning is a vulnerable process. Why do you see it as that?
Because students show up and they fail. They don't know all of the information that's going to be presented. You have to try again. You have to pick yourself up. You have to ask questions when you don't know, oftentimes in front of other people whose experience might be different from yours. And so this is especially true when children are being asked to do this in front of people who don't necessarily come from the same communities that they do. So that's what I think makes it so vulnerable.
And then you said something else about that process makes it harder when you're basically not able to be your whole self. What kind of barriers are there in that statement that exists for children or even for educators who have to show up at work?
So anything from little things like being told specifically what kind of uniform you have to wear, if that doesn't necessarily represent the gender that you identify with, as an educator or as an adult in the building, having people not use your correct pronouns or assume things about your personal life without giving you the space to expound upon that, I think can be incredibly isolating.
And Ray, what for you? Why do you think gender identity is so important to lift up? Especially, again, you've led schools and you've dealt with little people, right? A lot of times when we're thinking about gender identity, people are thinking about it in the space of when people are getting in high school, and we'll talk about later how sex and gender orientation is like just mushed together. But you deal a lot with the little people who are just coming to understand about who they are, their bodies, and like all other things. Why is it important for us to lift up gender identity when we're dealing with little folks?
Absolutely. So going back to what Chloe said, this idea that representation matters, action and inaction matters. Even if I'm connecting and conversing with a trans member of my community and I don't use the correct pronoun, students in the background feel and see that. They know what that looks like. They know what that means. If I don't correct a colleague who misgenders a colleague, and I don't correct them and I don't share in the moment that actually is not appropriate, students feel and they see that, and they're making sense of the world that surrounds them. So it's my job to, one, create systems and structures that allows them the access to learn this in a formal setting, but also create it in a manner that is a part of a loving and affirming space as well. So for example, at Prep Elementary, really excited about the work that Chloe and one of our social workers are spearheading. They took a look at our most recent sexual education curriculum. And within that, they recognized that there is no conversation around gender identity. There's no conversation around sexual orientation. So how do we embed that into the curriculum? How do we embed that into formal structures to best uplift and affirm all of our students and be unapologetic about it? Like, we have to create spaces that, one, affirm students, but two, also creates formal settings and structures so that they can access the education to navigate the world that surrounds them. So for a number of reasons, I can go on and on and on in terms of why it's important, but specifically for school leaders in this space and for educators in this space, it is one thing to make sure that you do it from a space of like narration and just a space of like loving, but it's also equally important to dismantle and interrupt and disrupt the systems within that school or within that community that doesn't address gender identity as well. And something as simple as curricula that doesn't address it speaks volumes. So always looking at it from both lenses.
Definitely. But then I think that's great to talk about, especially how kids experience it. But if I'm an adult, right? Because I think that sometimes people ignore what adults need, right? We still need to be supported. We still need to be loved, and we still need to be affirmed. So I'm an adult in a space and I identify as a member of the LGBTQIA family. What is it like for me when people aren't affirming my gender identity? What does that feel like? Have either of you had to experience that?
I think I've definitely experienced that in previous roles, and it definitely makes it difficult to be open and to be receptive, and to perform on a team. I think that it makes me feel like I don't necessarily belong, and that's such an important experience for me to have, because it makes it that much easier for me to show up for students.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and when we start tapping in terms of like intersectionality, right? I have to recognize, as a Black gay man, there is still male privilege that is attached to my identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never felt isolated. I've never felt any type of push in terms of my identity as a cisgender male. And because of that privilege that comes with my maleness, I have isolated at times members of the community in which I'm a part of. And that was a learning process for me too. That was a learning process for me to say, like, no, you're not utilizing the correct pronouns, and you're actually perpetuating the things that you're trying to discredit and dismantle. So even with all of these moving pieces, as a Black gay man, my male privilege has not had me privy to experiences where I felt that I was victimized, treated poorly, not lifted, not affirmed for my gender identity. And it is my responsibility as a Black gay male, as someone who is a part of marginalized groups, to name that for my trans sisters and brothers, for gender identity in all respects. So just a couple of things that come to mind.
So I want to get deeper into that, but what I want to do is lift up the idea of pronouns, because that's going to probably be used constantly throughout this conversation. And I want people to understand what we're talking about and why this is important. So why is it important that we respect the use of people's pronouns?
When you ask a person their pronouns and when you use the correct pronouns, what you're doing is saying, I see you and I invite you wholeheartedly into this space to participate. And that's so important when you're asking someone to be a teammate with you, when you're asking someone to do the hard work of educating students. It's important that you see them and that you recognize who they are.
And Chloe, you might ask Chloe a quick question?
Of course.
With that being said, Chloe, oftentimes I know that I am trying to find the right language, and I get so caught in my head when the correct pronouns aren't used by colleagues. What do you suggest to me or other colleagues in terms of disrupting like this understanding?
Yeah, so I think that if you are meeting someone for the first time, you could say something like, well, these are my pronouns. I just want to do a quick pronoun check. What pronouns do you go by? And then if you notice that someone is using the wrong pronouns in the moment, you could say something like, I just want to set the record straight for a second. This is these person's pronouns. And always check in with the person that you're referring to, because sometimes, depending on a person's level of outness, they may go by one set of pronouns with people that they feel safe with, and then a different set of pronouns depending on the circumstances. So that can get a little bit tricky, but just always grounding it in, checking with the person and understanding what makes them most comfortable.
And for people who are watching who may not understand what you meant by outness and safety, can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that I enjoy the privilege of being out in most spaces that I'm in. You know, I identify as a non-binary transgender person, but we see on the news all the time that a lot of transgender people are targeted just for being who they are. And so it can actually physically be unsafe for a person to be out, especially when you are working with students. Students might use a certain name or certain pronouns at school where they've established a safe space. But if you're in front of other people, other community members, and sometimes even family members, you want to check in.
Got it. And Chloe, I want to shout out to you for sharing yourself with us and the vulnerability to do that. I just appreciate you coming on and doing that wholeheartedly. But for the folks out here, because we do have a lot of folks, one of the reasons why I want to lift this topic up, because it's educational. Some people are just ignorant to the fact, and some people don't educate themselves. Can you explain to people your identity when you say you identify as non-binary trans? Can you explain that to someone? Well, to all of us?
Yeah. So I think that most of us grew up understanding gender as a binary, and that there are two options, that a person is either a man or a woman. And so the idea of being a non-binary transgender person is that gender is a spectrum, and people can identify anywhere along the spectrum. And for me personally, being non-binary means that I don't necessarily experience gender on either end. I like to identify myself as being right in the middle. But I do want to say that for other non-binary people, this could be very different. This could mean that they identify with both, and it could change as they grow and get to know themselves.
Dope. And then the other thing, can you explain to us more about pronouns and how we identify? Because some people don't understand that connection or that concept either, right? Because gender is taught in the binary, people only understand he associated with male and she associated with female.
Yeah, I think that one of the cool things about being alive in 2021 is that there are so many people who are coming out and sharing, actually, this is the way that I identify. So some people use she, her pronouns. Some people use he, him pronouns. I personally use they, them. And those pronouns can represent different things. So just getting into the habit of, just because a person uses a certain pronoun doesn't necessarily mean that you can assume anything about their gender. Using their pronoun just means that this is how you'd like to be referred to, and I'm agreeing to do that because, again, I want to invite you into this space, and I want to invite you into a relationship with me.
And at the heart of this entire conversation, we're saying it without saying it. It's about respecting people, and respecting people for who they are and how they would like to show up in the world. But there's also some understanding of, like, how we're taught and make it in comparison to racial terms, right? How we're taught that white is dominant. We talk about gender is beyond a binary. That there is people, there is more than in the world than just he or she, male or female. And it's not something that people are making up and people are waking up and saying, you know what, today I decided I wanted to be this. Like, it's a real thing. It's biology, it's science, it's all of that. But wanting people to understand that. Because as leaders in the space and leaders in the school, if you're a cisgender person or identify, it's important for you to understand how to respect and affirm your staff that you are working with. Chloe already gave us the example about this work is hard. It's not only hard for kids, it's hard for students. But imagine trying to do this work and not even being able to be you or be who you are. And I just think about existing in a heteronormative environment. And people are asking you things like, "Oh, are you married? Oh, do you have kids?" Or assuming like, "So, Mr. Fields, do you have a wife?"
Right.
I'm pretty sure you've been asked that.
Right. Very much so. And it's almost, as I think about how I've progressed in my own identity, my own confidence, and my own understanding of self. Very early on in my career, when I was a teacher, I would shy away from that. So if someone would say something to the effect of, "Oh, who's your wife?" or like, "Do you have like," and I would say, "Oh, I don't have one," and I would not speak to that. And that, to me, literally stifled my ability to become true to myself. Of course, years progressed, and I stayed true in all of who I am, and that is a gay man. No, I do not have a wife. I have a partner. His name is. This is who I am. And I think the 22-year-old me would have felt ashamed, embarrassed, and nervous to share that truth. But 38-year-old me, I'm about to be 39. 38-year-old me, look, I'm ready for it too. 38-year-old me is just like, you know what? This is me. This is who I am. And families, community, colleagues have been receptive, affirming, and accepting of who I am. And I think oftentimes we become so nervous about what do we expose, what do we share, and it stifles who we are. So especially in this Pride Month, like, how are you affirming those who are part of the LGBTQI community and ensuring that they're able to share their stories in safe spaces and allowing their journey to be their journey? It's just something that comes to mind.
Definitely. And I would ask both of you as leaders, for folks who may not know how to do that, how can they? So, people just nosy and you work together, right? So people always asking questions. Are there ways that people can create affirming environments for marginalized groups so where they feel comfortable sharing that kind of information? So instead of saying, "Hey, Mr. Fields, how's your wife?" or "Do you have a wife?" How could they ask that?
Yeah, I think there's so many things that may seem small that affirms. As representation matters, language matters.
Yep.
When you send out a staff survey and you're asking people for their shirt size or things of that nature, do you have a space where they can share their pronouns as well? When you are talking to colleagues, do you automatically say like, how's your wife or how's your husband? Or how do you make sure that you're inclusive of language such as partner or significant other? When you have a Pride Month, is it acknowledged? Do you shy away from the truth and the reality that there are 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds who know exactly where they are in terms of their sexual orientation, and that we want to acknowledge and lift that and make spaces where that is recognized and they are loved on and that they can feel that. When you are in the role of school leadership as an educator in the LGBTQI community, if someone uses a derogatory term, are you willing to step up and say that is absolutely unacceptable? And this is how it impacts me directly. And this is what it means for our school community as a whole. So I think there's so many things, both large and small, that you can do, whether you are an ally or whether you are a member of the community, to ensure that we create safe and affirming spaces.
Definitely, shout out. And we've been referring to also in this conversation many times, like a lot of times when we talk about our LGBTQI family, we mesh together gender and sexual orientation. But those are two different things. And I would love to hear both of your thoughts on that before I speak on that.
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think that it's possible for a person to identify as transgender and also to identify as straight. Just like it's also possible for a person to identify as cisgender or not transgender, and then to identify as gay or queer. It's just about making sure that you're not making assumptions based off of the information that a person presents you with.
Facts. Because even a lot of times I have this discussion with my niece when we talk about LGBTQI. LGB really refers to your sexual orientation. The T part, trans, technically refers to how you identify in your gender, right? How you show up in spaces. But Q and I, kind of the same. That has to do with your sexual orientation. And I think that a lot of times when we're talking about LGBTQI, people aren't affirming people's genders because they're just ignorant to it and don't understand it. But people are judging people based on their sexual orientation, which is problematic for me. So I would love to hear again you guys' thoughts on that. And how can we create an atmosphere where we're affirming people's gender, but not really digging too much into their sexual orientation?
Oh, that's a great question.
Oh, did I speak wrong? My bad.
Because in full transparency, Shayna, it's something that I question if I've not done well. And like, this is a reflective moment for me. And if there's one thing I want to pull from this conversation as a Black gay man, is like, you can still have your stuff and be a part of the community and perpetuate stuff. So in this moment, I'm asking myself, how have I not ensured avenues to differentiate or to acknowledge that those are two different identities, two different understandings? So like, I'm having a reflective moment more so than here's how I've been of a support.
Gotcha.
I think that it's important to create spaces where people can share as much as they feel comfortable sharing. In a professional setting, I can totally see where gender identity is important, right? Because you want to have bathrooms for people, you want to refer to people the correct way, but then there are some people who are very private about who they date, if they date. So just making it okay for them to not have to share that without making assumptions.
Definitely. I think that's a great point. That making it okay for people to share as much as they would like. And I think that because cisgender people are used to, and I don't, trust me, I'm not like an expert on any of this. But existing in a world that's heteronormative, you're able to just to talk to what you would consider other straight people and say like, hey, like you're just having a general conversation. But then you assume, right, because the world is heteronormative, you can talk to other people the same way. So the easy example was what I gave earlier. If I say something to Ray about hey, do you have a wife? Like, what women are you dating? And Chloe, people can look at you and assume, right, what your gender is instead of asking you how you prefer. And then even based on how you identify or what you say, make an assumption about your sexual orientation, right? Which I think that sometimes leads to so many different issues within education. And I see it a lot for me, again, which is why we're having this topic for adult staff, not feeling comfortable in spaces, not being able to show up as their whole self in spaces, or feeling like you felt back in the day, right? Like you were ashamed or you had to lie. Or are they going to be judgmental? Or what kind of love or support am I going to receive in this space? And I think that's super, super important for us to highlight. But I definitely think that the focus, I just wanted to make the distinction between gender and sexual orientation, because I see that they get meshed together so much. And I'm like, they're not the same. When you identify today, Ray, you said, I am Black, which is your race. I am a male, which is how you identify by gender. And I am gay, which is how you identify by your sexual orientation. They are three different things. And I think people need to understand that it's important to pay attention to all three of those parts of Raymond and all three of those parts of Chloe, because they are all part of who folks are. And to ignore a part of a person, sometimes I feel like we get into this thing where which is why sexual orientation is so sensitive, in my opinion. So how you meet white folks who say like, I don't see color, right? Like, you just out here blind. You're not going to say, I see Ray, but I don't see him as gay. Child, he is gay. And if he expressed to us that he is gay, you're not going to ignore that. I think what's important to point out here, we don't make an assumption that Ray is gay. We don't assume his sexual orientation. We affirm and we support what part of that Ray or whatever part Chloe shares with us. Right. But once it's shared, you're not going to say, I don't see him as gay.
Right.
He's gay. Right. Like, you're not, he told us he was.
Right.
I don't see Chloe as non-binary. How? She told you she was. So what? They told you they were. So what do you see them as?
Yep.
if they told you they were non-binary, what are you going to gender them as? Yep. So I think that this is really an important part of the conversation to lift up. There is a difference between gender and sexual orientation, and we do have to allow people to be comfortable sharing as much as they would like. Absolutely. So I would love to ask you guys to dig a little bit more into your personal journeys, because both of you have been through the education system. You've been students, then you've been teachers, and now you are both leaders. But through that, can you remember some times where you felt like you were actually able to bring your whole self to work, or that journey of getting there?
I would say that the time where I felt, I don't want to even use the word comfortable, because there's something that's kind of like that marginalized with like this, the word comfort. The time that I felt the most affirmed, the most true to self in my own form, in my own skin, was when I was an assistant principal in DC. And I was working alongside, and it's not my space to share how she identifies, but I was working alongside a Black woman who was cognizant and was aware of the language that she used around me. That was aware and willing to confront those that didn't properly identify me as a gay man. That was aware and confident in her ability to create spaces where it was okay to say, oh, his boyfriend's coming, their girlfriend's, like, it was just embedded within the school community. And that allowed me to realize that we shouldn't even label it as being progressive. It's just the necessity. Like, it should just be the way that it is. And we hold people on high when they use progressive language, or when they use or create spaces of comfort for members of the LGBTQI community, rather than saying that this is the way that it's supposed to be. And during that time, I saw a school leader who just made it the way that it was supposed to be your full self, your authentic self, affirmed in language, interactions, relationships, whatever the case may be. And I was then able to model that for the people that I worked alongside. And that trickled into my personal life as well. So that's just a quick example of like, when I remember like a pointed example of like how I actually came true to self in every regard and sense of the understanding.
But your experience was important because a leader affirmed you and allowed you and supported you and gave you the comfortability in the space to be who you were. And that's dope. That's dope.
I think for me personally, the coolest thing that has happened as far as being seen for who I am is when members of our Parent-Teacher Association have asked me my pronouns. Just that level of awareness and willingness to be inclusive, I just thought is so cool. And it speaks volumes for our students' lived experiences. And I just love the way that things have changed. I remember being a young high school teacher, and a lot of my students never having met a queer person before, and having to break it in with just very basic things, that this is a thing that's possible. Going from that to 5 years later, and even parents are aware, I think just speaks volumes to how important inclusivity is.
Definitely. One of our viewers had a really good point, and I would love for both of you to hit on this. Tanisha People says, I have issues with being further tokenized based on how I identify. And I want to know if either of you could speak to that, or been in a situation or in any organization where you felt like tokenized.
Absolutely. I mean, so often. And I think that going back to what you shared earlier, 3 key components of how I identify as a Black, gay, male, specifically as Black and as gay, oftentimes, especially when you work in organizations that hold white male dominance culture, being tokenized is par for the course. Like, it is literally happens in terms of when you are asked to speak, or in microaggressions in terms of just the things that are subtly said. But when you start to peel back the layers, you recognize like there's definitely more to that. Or even when you think about certain stereotypes that are attributed to Black gay men. Oh, that's the way you dress, or that's the way, or that's how you, like, all of these things. And it's almost like you are a piece of animation rather than a human being. Like, you are something to be seen, not necessarily heard, but definitely for the entertainment of the masses. So I've absolutely felt that in times past in terms of feeling tokenized based upon my identity. But most importantly, how do I show up in that moment to say like, no, that's not right. We're not doing that. Or no, as the leader of this school, how do I ensure that we create spaces where that's named out loud? And that leads to uncomfortable conversations. Just this week, we had an incredibly interesting conversation with staff members where they gave me feedback about how they felt tokenized. So it's interesting, but it is something that like I'm constantly reflecting on in my role as a principal and just as a Black gay man specifically.
Dope. Chloe, any experiences for you with feeling tokenized or how people can overcome that?
Yeah, I think that I tend to be the only trans person at any given job. I can think of only one time where there was another transgender person, and I think we were both very shocked. And I think that I think that because I'm so used to being the only one, it can be difficult for me to like stand up for myself when I realize that people are tokenizing me or being disrespectful, either intentionally or unintentionally. So something that I try to lean into is I try to remind myself that I have the right to show up And I have the right to just be a person. I don't know all the things about being trans. I don't have all of the answers to all of the questions. You know, I've only lived in this one body and I've only had this one experience. And so I try to remind people of that.
And I think that's important for people to realize, especially what you just said. Like, I've only lived in this one body. I've only had this one experience. So I think that is sometimes hard for people to understand, like, she's trans, but she's not a science project. Like, she's a person. This is actually who she is. So we want to be asking 1,000 questions, and I'm guilty of it too, because trying to learn and be curious. But this is actually who she is as a person. This is how she shows up in the world, but this is her. Meaning that to say, like, just think about being a straight person where everything is geared for you. If somebody asks you 1,000 questions about, like, well, you're straight or your gender, like, well, how are you this and how do you do this? Like, we don't have to suffer. We're not oppressed in that way. But I think that is very important for people to keep in the forefront of their minds, that you are human and you are literally out here just being you, nothing else, just being you. So you being you is not to be questioned. It's not to be picked apart. It's not to, are you sure you are? Well, maybe something happened. No, they're out there being them, period. So I love how you said that. Like, I've only lived in this one body. I've only had this one experience, and there's nothing else to that. We're all living and being who we are. So kind of like to point out what Ray said about being progressive. Like, I'm not being understanding. I'm being respectful of another human being in their existence. And I think that is super important to lift. Ray,
and then it's just this idea around, like, intentionality too. Like, am I not utilizing the right pronouns out of pure disrespect, out of ignorance? Am I doing it because, like, it's just so normed in terms of the society that we are a part of? Like, I know that Chloe and I have worked together for the past 3 years, and I've misgendered them in times past. And I can imagine how exhausting it must be to say to me, Ray, my pronouns are. So, like, how do we actually lift that up, raise that up, but not ad nauseum to the point where the person who is not being affirmed has to do this time and time and time again? So I'm sharing that to say that it is a collective responsibility of all to make sure that we are correcting, that we are supporting, because it should not be the sole responsibility of the gay man or the trans person to correct the individuals, whether it was on purpose or whether it was not intentional, to not provide the right identity. So one thing I will say is that, and we've all experienced, well, I can only say I've experienced, and I would assume that you all experienced, like, I can't speak as the Black person at every white function.
That's right.
I can't do that. That's not my job. That's not my aim. However, what I hope is that there's a white ally, or there's another Black person or another person of color that is able to speak and to support on my behalf, because I am exhausted.
Yes.
So with that being said, how do I, as a Black gay man, recognize that maybe the intentions weren't to misgender, the individual, but I am equally responsible to correct and support and to affirm and uplift when it takes place?
And I think something that I try to realize is, everybody's trying, or at least I assume that everybody's trying. And so I know that, especially with the pronouns thing, it's a little funky. I know that a lot of people don't have practice with it. And so I hope that through knowing me, they get to practice more, so that way, especially in our line of work, that when you're with students, you're a little bit smoother in inviting them to the space and using the correct pronouns.
And Chloe, you said the right word, the practice. And the reason why I'm lifting that up, because I think there's a few times today that I've misgendered you. And it is literally because I don't have practice. I don't have experience, because I've been living in a world where things are binary, where I generally only use he or she and talking to a singular person. So getting experience, getting knowledge, getting exposure, I think all of that is super important in order to affirm folks of the LGBTQI family. So again, I'll say to you, I appreciate your vulnerability today. I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us and being with us. And again, not because you are some like, oh, Chloe, some anomaly, because I think that there are many people across this nation who share the same views, values, ideals, gender identity as you do. But because of how we are as a society, would never live out loud ever. And I also want our cisgender people to also lean into, or people, period, because Ray is also expressing that him as a gay male is still learning. So for everybody to lean into, like, it's uncomfortable, it's a nervousness. But lean into the practice, lean into respecting people and who they are as their whole selves, and educate yourselves. Absolutely. Educate yourselves. So how can organizations be more inclusive or create a more inclusive environment for our LGBTQI family and educators? How can they do that?
Yeah, I think it's very
experience that made you feel like safe and affirmed.
I think that it goes back to what you said earlier, and that representation matters. The way to create spaces where marginalized groups are affirmed and heard is by ensuring that those in senior leadership have seats at the table who are a part of those identities. So how can you ever enact, or how do you ever put into place something that affirms me as a Black gay male if you have no representation of Black gay men in the spaces that creates the budget, the structures, the systems, the curricula, the language, the values, the moral compass of the organization? I would push organizations to make sure that representation is not also from a place of trying to tokenize, and to ensure that we have representation that truly speaks to the wide range of dynamics of the world that we live in, and not for the sake of checking something off. So I really do believe it's about who's in the seat, who has a seat at the table to make the decisions that are driving the course forward.
I've also seen explicit trainings be successful in the past because, again, people only know what they know, and people make a lot of mistakes simply because they haven't been exposed. So I think the cool thing about being in a position of leadership is being able to invite organizations in to do explicit teaching, and therefore you're not putting the burden on your marginalized staff members to be like the see all be all for their coworkers.
And in those trainings, have you seen any explicit strategies that could work for folks listening?
Yeah, when I was a teacher, we had this really neat training about gender. And one of the things that the presenter did was just get people used to saying different words that they're not used to saying, like get used to saying transgender, get used to saying cisgender. And I think that invited people to step outside of their comfort zone in a space where it was safe to fail and to not get things right. Because I think a lot of people feel, and I'm sure we've all experienced this as Black people around white people, they're so afraid to make a mistake, that they don't approach you, that they don't try, and that's not conducive to learning or to relationship building.
Can I build on to what Chloe just shared as well?
Yep.
That matters, and like the explicit training matters, and like providing people with the language matters, but the inherent culture of the organization also matters. If a student walks down the hallway and they say, Mr. Chloe or Miss Chloe, who is in the sideline saying, actually, that is not appropriate, that is incorrect, and here is why. So as much as it is about the technical trainings that are necessary to provide people the formal outlets, it is also about the inherent culture of the organizations in which we are a part of.
But even what you just said, right, is hitting me because I'm like, dang, Mr., Mrs., brother, sister, things that, again, in the heteronormative culture, we're so used to titling people in those ways, and that sinks down to children. But how an educator who identifies as non-binary might not even use titles, what that may make that person feel like. And I just think that that's something that we may consider small, but it's so big and can really transform a culture and how we look at people people, again, how we support people and how we show up for people. So I think that was actually an awesome example. And I know I probably have a lot of co-conspirators watching right now, like, "Ooh, this is a lot," like, because there's so many things that we don't see or we don't notice, again, because of hetero privilege, right? Like, we don't think about that. Yeah. But just like folks have to take accountability for white privilege, we have to take responsibility for hetero privilege, just like you have to take responsibility for male privilege, like all of those things. Yep. We have to recognize and work on them and understand how they make people feel. One thing that I think is so important to lift up and kind of get on a positive note, both of you kind of share, but I would love for both of you to talk more about it, your experience with your families. So being able to show up for your families as your whole self, because I think that people will make an assumption, especially both of you work in Black low-income communities, and there's this stigma about how the Black community is anti-gay. But I think both of you have had positive experiences with our family. So I would love for you to share that. I think it's encouraging.
Yeah. I mean, simply stated, our families are dope. They are the best. They are the most loving. They are the most affirming. They are the most defensive when someone doesn't identify you correctly. Like, what you're not going to do to Mr. Fields is. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on. But when I think about my early 20s and just how reluctant I was to like truly show myself and share myself, and there were assumptions that were made and, you know, things of that nature. But moving forward in terms of like being able to say, I'm an openly Black gay male, and families recognizing that, families, and it's not a caricature. It's not like he has to be this stereotype or he has to be this certain thing. Like, there are many parts of me that I identify as, and my gayness is not the totality of the summation of who I am. It's a part of who I am. To have families that recognize that speaks volumes, speaks about the love. Because when it comes down to it, however you identify, my experience and my reality is, from parents, you love my kid, I love you.
Yep.
And it's always been as simple as that. If you love my child, I love you. And as a matter of fact, if someone talks to you crazy, we have a problem, because this is a family, this is a unit. So like that has been my experience in education. Chloe, I'm not sure if you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, for sure. The families at our school are so cool, and they're so inclusive and supportive. And, you know, they ask really insightful questions. You know, I've had parents who have noticed that their kids call me Miss Chloe and they'll correct them. And that's really neat to experience. So yeah, it's been great.
I think that's awesome. I think it's awesome. And I think that that's encouraging, because I think what lifts up and what both of you guys said, you love people's children. And when people see you for your authentic self, the authenticity that you bring to a space and the love and care that you have for their children, they could care less. And they're going to respect you because you respect their child. Right. And I think one of the biggest things I've learned from families, your sexual orientation is your business, right? Like, I've learned that so much from families. Child ain't none of my business. I'm like, always like, okay, what that got to do with this reading, writing, this math? Let's talk about these grades.
Right.
And that is the focus. But this underlying notion that the Black community is so judgmental of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, I think that is also a narrative that we need to create a counter narrative for. At the heart of it, we are a community. We are not monolithic, and people love people, and people respect people. And when you wholeheartedly show up and care for somebody's child, people are going to love you no matter who you are.
Absolutely. And speaking to that, we're just not one hodgepodge of things. Like, our families aren't a monolith as well. We have trans parents. We have parents from single family households, but their father identifies as gay. Like, we have, like, you want to make sure that you are creating the outlets and the spaces and the mirrors for the communities in which you serve. And what I can take pride in as part of the work that we do at Prep L is the fact that our families see us in them and we see ourselves in them as well. So it's one of those things that when you create a culture and a space that is affirming, that is a loving of LGBTQI community members, it translates into the openness that families provide in terms of their experiences as well. And I question if my openness, or if other members of the school community openness wasn't there, would families feel inclined to bring their full selves into the community? Would they feel threatened or concerned that they can be as open as they would like, or that they should be able to be based upon the culture that we did or did not create?
I think that's amazing, pointing it out that way, building out this two-way street of, in order to receive that affirming, loving kind of space from parents, that happened because you showed up as your whole self, right, and they wrapped their arms around you. So I think that is super important to highlight and point out. And what advice would you give to somebody who doesn't feel like they are in a supportive environment for LGBTQI folks? Because I think that we have many people out there who are living under regimes where they don't feel supported, where they don't feel affirmed.
Yeah,
I would say do what feels safest. I think sometimes the narrative in the media is that out is the best way. But you have to provide for yourself. You have to provide for your family, and you know what feels safest. So that would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. Similar, yet slightly different. Find your tribe, find your people, find the spaces that make you feel safe, where you can be your authentic self. Because on this journey, as you are getting to know yourself, as you are getting to navigate both personal and professional spaces, doing it alone is not the route. So please make sure that you are really thinking about, who are my people? Where are my outlets? Where are the people that are mirrors of me, but still will hold me true to form when I am falling short, but create spaces of comfort, however you identify.
That's right. And are there any specific policies or strategies that schools can implement to ensure that our LGBTQI educators feel safe and feel heard?
Absolutely.
Like, I don't know if there's anything specifically that you guys do at Prep L or in the current organization that you work for. Any specific policies that are implemented that make you feel affirmed?
Yeah, there are a number of things. I would say something as simple as creating gender neutral restrooms speaks volumes. Thinking about the language that we use, thinking about the sexual education curricula that is presented to students, and does it speak to gender identity or sexual orientation? There are so many different aspects that when you start to peel back the layers, like Chloe said something brilliant before, and I didn't even think about it. We had a very brief conversation about setting the vision for our school, and we talked about what the uniform should look like. And I walked in with this idea that the uniform should look like this way for the boys and this way for the girls. And then Chloe pushed back and said, like, we should think about having like a central standard situation, and then people can identify. It's small things like that that speaks volumes to the experiences that we do or don't provide to our kids to create loving, affirming, safe spaces, and for our colleagues as well that identify as LGBTQI.
Yeah, even with that language, I'm sitting here thinking about dress codes, right? In spaces and places, and what they actually speak to and how that makes people feel. But again, things that we ignore with privilege is super important. Chloe, anything you want to add to that policy and strategy topic that folks can implement to affirm folks and make educators feel safe?
I think ask questions when you have them. I'm always humbled when people come to me and they say things like, "Hey, I don't really know how to do this, but I want to do this. Can you help me?"
They'll always ask questions. Well, guys, we are actually winding down on time.
Oh, so wow. That was fast.
Once the conversation starts flowing, it starts flowing. But what I always love to give my guests an opportunity to do right before we end is any parting words to our supporters, folks watching out there, that you would like to leave us with.
Just thank you for this opportunity to share our truths, to share our experiences. My hope is that you're able to take from this and to build stronger connections, to be stronger advocates, to be stronger allies, or to feel that you've been represented in this conversation. And definitely would love to continue it post this podcast if possible. I appreciate you, Shana, for the work that you do. I love you beyond words. And I can't even think of a time that there's been a platform like this, which speaks volumes. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I love you too, boo.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Thank you so much for opening this conversation. I think that it's such an important one to have, and just thank you for the space.
Of course. As we wind down, as always, I want to shout out all my co-conspirators out there for watching, all my new supporters who came this week to watch Building the Black Educator Pipeline. Is every Thursday live at 12. Please like, please share, and thank you for your comments, especially you, Tanisha. You were very active today, so I appreciate you. As always, we just love you. We thank you. Thank you for supporting the Center for Black Educator Development. And thank you for supporting Citizens Ed on this platform. So we'll see you next week live here at